Hello and welcome to another Atypling Philosopher video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce, and I am super excited to be joined again for the second time by Tim White, who is a Ukraine expert. Tim has, I won't let him give you the full introduction he gave last time because obviously we have limited time, but just a really quick intro, Tim, about your Ukraine experience.
Well, stretching back over 20 years now, I've been involved with Ukraine, teaching there, making friends, traveling, looking at the situation, and being involved in one of the foremost universities, probably the most Western leaning and progressive university. And let's give a shout out to Mahila Academy and to anyone of the alumni that may be joining us today as well. I hope there's a few. And therefore, obviously, I was actually out in Ukraine in February, just before the full invasion. And I've kept an eye on Ukrainian affairs on my Twitter feed ever since day one of being on Twitter, I think. So partly professional, partly personal, got a lot of friends out there, some of whom are fighting in the war right now.
Wow. So, personal connections as well as professional. Lots has happened in the last couple of days. Sometimes I wonder how I can spend so long talking in my videos about Ukraine every single day. It's just like, it's just this endless succession of talking points. The big one is the missiles. So, Russia unleashed a torrent of missiles across Ukraine yesterday. Which was bad enough in itself. But then there was this news of a couple of missiles hitting Poland. And a lot of people got very excited at the beginning, myself included, thinking, well, these are Russian missiles that have hit Poland. Now it's coming out that it's Ukrainian air defense missiles. And then there are some saying that it's possibly a little bit of both. And I guess this is a cautionary tale to not be too excited about certain news pieces and to wait till the dust settles a little bit before reporting on them. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's the most important point, is to check the facts. However, and I'm not a conspiracy theorist in any way, shape or form, usually, but I have put out a little conspiracy on Twitter actually just an hour or so ago, I guess, like Jonathan, where I'm pretty skeptical of this very hasty, I won't say a court, but investigation and announcement from the US first, while Poland was saying a Russian missile, i.e. one manufactured in Russia, had landed. Obviously, it must have had Cyrillic writing or something like that, one would suggest. Didn't preclude the fact that it could have been Ukrainian. And indeed, one of the first tweets I put out after the incident was a journalist saying his information was that a Polish journalist, I might add, was that it was indeed a Ukrainian missile that had either landed or had inadvertently knocked out the Russian original missile over Polish territory, an anti-air defense missile from Ukraine, an S-300 that has now supposedly been what was found near the Ukrainian border. However, one would have thought that Poland might have been able to ascertain this first of all before the US, which even before I went to bed last night, long before, it seemed that they'd already jumped to the conclusion that it wasn't fired by Russia, shall we say, and then backed that up this morning. And hastily, the whole of the EU and seemingly NATO that I've heard and seen quotes from so far, including the General Secretary in his press conference saying that, okay, it wasn't fired by Russia. However, Russia is still responsible, i.e. there wouldn't have been any defense missiles needed to be fired if Russia wasn't committing atrocities and firing missiles on a peaceful country in the first place. But why I'm suspicious is something I posted again within the last half an hour, I think, saying, do you remember this? And Jake Sullivan, the White House spokesman, saying on March the 11th specifically, and it's there in black and white, there are audio and video recordings as well of Mr. Sullivan saying at the White House press briefing that even if a missile landed accidentally in NATO territory, that there would be a severe reaction, i.e. that Article 5, that I'm sure you all know about, would be invoked. Now, the fact that it clearly wasn't right, I think, Jonathan, had Article 5 been invoked and military action taken against a small accidental, potentially, incursion. But there's also quite a train of thought that Putin, who's shall we say, tested Moldova in recent days and recent weeks. A big hack there as well that one of my online friends, Velvet Blade on Twitter, has been looking into. And also, is he pushing NATO here? Is he testing the responses? Has he deliberately fired into Polish territory, NATO territory, very near the border, with plausible deniability that it was an accident or a misfiring missile or something similar to that? And has NATO conveniently come up with the perfect solution of saying, well, yeah, Russia was responsible, but it wasn't actually their missile, so we can't do anything else? Whatever, if that is the case, and my maybe rather wacky conspiracy theory proves correct, then maybe some good will come out of it, in that Russia behind the scenes has been absolutely reprimanded in the, we know what you really did, we're trying to make sure this doesn't escalate. But at the same time, let's hope that there is some sort of air defense that is introduced, preferably over the whole of Ukraine, but certainly for the border area between Poland and Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very, very tall order, isn't it? To a lot of people talk about Iron Dome as this Israeli defense system that works very well for a small country, particularly against drones and not necessarily against cruise missiles. Ukraine is a very large, geographically large country, and therefore, protecting all of these electricity substations out in the middle of nowhere is a difficult, it's a tall order, and I think that's the challenge I have. Here is someone saying, I wonder how the editors of these papers feel this morning after running with wildly speculative and not verified front page splashes, which increasingly look well. So there people do jump to these conclusions, and then just a little bit further on from that. Just here we have
Jonathan, may I just interrupt you? Could you just go back to the top of that page and that post? Because if you read those carefully, one said Russian missile. Well, it was a Russian manufactured missile, and the other one has in quotes, someone is saying Russian, I can't read what the second is, Russian missile, I think, isn't it? Russian missiles in quotes hit Poland. So journalistically, they've done exactly the right thing. There's nothing wrong there. Russian bomb has hit Poland, people died, Russian missiles have been found. Russian manufactured doesn't mean they fired them. Indeed, another angle is it could have been fired from Belarus. Belarus could have been firing them. We do not know exactly what happened, even if we take at face value that what NATO has said and what the US has said today is true.
And then you've got Shashank Joshi, who writes for The Economist, defense correspondent. Belgian defense minister is the first official with access to intelligence to express view that it was a Ukrainian air defense missile, but not just that. Quote, pieces of Russian missiles and the Ukrainian interception missile are said to have landed in Poland. And again, there are some people saying now it's only one missile or one instance rather than two, so on and so forth. But I mean, I guess the point is that, these things are still up in the air to some degree. The interesting point for me is, Article 5, for those who don't know, as you said, is the article that says if one NATO country is attacked, then all NATO countries can come to that country's aid. So attack on one is attack on all. But then you get Article 4, which has been invoked, I think, 8 times since the creation of these ideals, is something that says, okay, we can discuss this in an emergency meeting and put some action into place. So lots of people are talking about whether Article 4 will be invoked here. But I guess you've got this wider discussion about if a missile accidentally lands in Poland. So say Russia is aiming it somewhere near Poland, but in Ukraine, and it goes wrong, circle error probable, it goes wrong and hits Poland. Is that a kind of a war crime? Is that what is that? Is it this? Is it that? And then you talk about, well, if they're holding back grain as they have done, or if they've hit energy infrastructure where that energy is being exported to other European countries and grain is being exported to other places in the world, and Russia has stopped that from happening, Russia are actually negatively affecting other countries around the world. And where does that leave those countries or people wanting to stand up for those countries? Is quite a difficult scenario.
It is. And I know why you're a philosopher after that question. Well, first of all, I mean, how many war crimes? Sorry, excuse me. It's not just a question of one or two. And the The grain blockage gives Russia a leverage, and we're about to see fertilizers released from European ports for the first time. Russia makes an awful lot of money. They're desperate for foreign currency. And we are beginning to notice that more and more African and some Asian countries, the poorest countries generally, are starting to abstain or vote with Russia in United Nations votes. So all of that is linked. These countries are desperate. These countries have been offered favors or food at a preferential rate, or any food, via Russia and potentially via Turkey as well. So they're gaining favor. And of course, doesn't matter how rich you are or how many people you have in your country, you just get one vote at the UN if you're just a tiny little island with a few hundred people, or whether the United States with many hundreds of millions of people. So that's
a really good point, because that a recent UN vote where it was about 80 something countries voted against Russia, a handful voted with Russia, but actually 70 something abstained, which is a huge number of countries abstaining from a vote against Russia. So yeah,
absolutely. And is it an act of aggression on NATO that requires a response? If a missile has landed now directly fired by Russia or Belarus, or if one lands in the future, then yes. I mean, in this instance, it has to be a proportional response, but there has to be some response. Otherwise, as we've seen repeatedly through recent history, Putin keeps pushing the bar and getting away with more and more. I mean, I harp onto something that I think I mentioned last time as well. Had Putin been dealt with, first of all, in the Russia-Georgia war, and then particularly when two of the major members of NATO, the United States and the United Kingdom, were signatories to the Budapest Memorandum, guaranteeing the sovereign integrity of Ukraine and its borders when Crimea was invaded. Had we done something at that point, then we wouldn't be in this situation. There would not have been a February invasion, as we've seen. There wouldn't have been hundreds of thousands of people dying in this war. But what sort of response is needed now, if indeed there was a Russian missile there? There may be something happening behind the scenes, as I alluded to, or if it happens in future, yes. If it's a direct attack on a Polish infrastructure or Polish people, and it isn't accidental, then it's serious trouble, isn't it? But if it is an accident, if it is plausible that a missile has accidentally strayed offline, then it's measure for measure, isn't it? You have to be very careful how you escalate things, but it's clearly an escalation, and I still think there's a fair chance that this was an escalation. This was Putin just testing the responses, similar to how we used to see Russian planes buzzing the Scandinavian, Nordic countries and British airspace in particular, just to test the response. That's still going on. So why wouldn't he do it with an odd stray missile?
Yeah, and I wonder whether, in some sense, just looking completely objectively from this, and I know two people died and etc., but but to take myself away from the emotion of anything here, like I wonder whether it might actually play into Ukraine's hands here somewhat, because there will be a more unified sense of repulsion with Russia, that even if it was a mistake in terms of a Ukrainian air defense missile hitting and going off course or whatever, like I think that it might benefit Ukraine maybe in the short term here.
Yeah, I think we saw that last night with the most aggressive statements being made from Ukrainian officials, including within the office of the president and indeed the president himself. But more so, they were related to the horror and outrage of the 90 cruise missiles that were fired on Ukraine during the day, I think. But it was a very opportune moment for Ukraine to try and rank up the pressure on Russia and on NATO to take some action and to get more brownie points, if you like, for want of an expression. But the Polish did play it straight by the book. They did say this had happened. They did say that it was a Russian-made missile. So it's very difficult, and I don't think we'll ever really know the whole truth, if I'm honest, Jonathan. But Ukraine was bound to do that, and they may get some benefit out of it. It may have happened anyway. As I think I said first time when we were chatting, I'm a strong advocate, and I've never been called a hawk before this war, but I'm a strong advocate for NATO or certain members of NATO agreeing to Ukraine's request to patrol the skies before the war started. The intelligence was there that was going to be an invasion. And yes, it may have put one of our air forces in danger, but would Russia deliberately shoot down a NATO aircraft, knowing all that involves, no matter how much he wanted to hurt and get his hands on Ukraine?
That's been mentioned in the live chat already. Yeah, the kind of no-fly zone. Also, NATO comes out often in these sort of conversations quite badly. I know some people look down upon NATO as a kind of not as it lacks the teeth, particularly because Russia are on the Security Council, right? So
Yeah,
whatever happens, there
I
needs to
think
be
you said,
some kind of reformation of.
yeah, I think. Sorry, I think you said NATO and you meant UN, didn't you? So
Oh,
yeah,
sorry, UN.
the
Oh,
UN is useless.
I'm completely
So
conflating both here. So yeah, thanks
yeah,
for calling me out.
I mean, I can completely agree. It's almost got to the stage of the League of Nations, hasn't it? Which was scrapped, and then Phoenix-like rise as the United Nations. It is ridiculous when no matter what happens in the world, an aggressor committing countless war crimes. I mean, there are too many to mention, individually and as a state, including the ultimate one of the aggressive move against a peaceful nation, the invasion of Ukraine, because without that, there would be no other war crimes. And they can veto anything. And also another member on the Security Council that is loving the conflict and very eager to keep it going. So both sides deplete themselves and will never vote in favor of any resolution against the other. So we're obviously talking about Russia and China. And I'm afraid, quite right, that who I didn't catch the name of who wrote that in, Jonathan, but the UN is not fit for purpose in most of what it is trying to do to achieve worldwide peace, particularly with regard to this war. So yeah, John, thanks, John.
Yeah, and that's really interesting to bring China in here. So I've come around to this idea. I was thinking quite a lot about this, about how China, my opinion, this is complete speculation, but I would say that China would want Russia to lose this war, but to be completely like debilitated by this war in the same way that kind of NATO want that and America want that. Actually, China would want China win either way. So if Russia do well out of this and win the war, then China steps in and say, well, we were kind of neutral, but we were sort of supportive of you, and we'll help you pick up the pieces and get back on your feet. But if Russia get completely destroyed out of this, then China will step in and say, well, we sat on the side because that was a bit of a stupid thing to do, and we'll help you pick up the pieces. By picking up the pieces will mean we'll take over your natural resource industries, we'll have a little look at the eastern provinces, so on and so forth. And I think that would play hugely into China's hands. So I think for this, any situation is a win-win for China. What were your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think either before or just after the last broadcast, privately we were chatting, weren't we, and discussing particularly the territorial aspect of this, where China does have certain ancient claims to the territories of the Far East. And I wouldn't be surprised to see China take advantage by trying to either invade or reclaim some of that territory in the future, depending upon how things turn out for Russia and who the leader is post-war. And while the US is spending an awful lot of money, while EU is spending an awful lot of money and struggling, and protests are rising in both sides of the Atlantic, and Russia is depleting its resources hand over fist in all aspects and struggling for any foreign currency, then China's sitting absolutely pretty, and it's just watching the two of its greatest rivals set themselves back quite a few years in some respects. And China will be the biggest beneficiary, I would think, which is disconcerting for the world order and for the West in general.
Yeah, and obviously we must remember that said, China is also on a precipice potentially of an economic, meltdown itself. So, and there are people who have different opinions on that, but it is looking, more and more like that could happen. But of course, the same can be said for the rest of the world. And in fact, this is something that worries me. When I look at the projections, or not the projections, but actually the economic stats for the UK. So here we've just helped out loads by giving £7 million, £5 million to the Ukraine in terms of energy infrastructure aid and all of this good stuff, which is really, really helpful. But at the same time, the economic outlook for the UK is the worst in the G7. We are really struggling, and I don't want to get into a whole Brexit thing, but we're out of Europe, so we don't have the comfort blanket of Europe. we just had announcements from George Eustace in Parliament saying that our trade deal with the Australia and New Zealand is crap, and he admitted that and said Truss rushed it through, and therefore, and all these pieces are coming together to make me think, do you know what? The UK is not in a great economic situation at all. Like, we've got a cost of living crisis and a recession looming. What does that look like in terms of helping out Ukraine in a sustainable path forward? And this will be the same for all the other countries around the world that will be going through similar things. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, riding out a recession is far easier for a dictator and a dictatorship, and that's why I don't think China will have that many worries. For the West, the biggest problem is often democracy, and it's one of the huge reasons why Russia has invested so much in money, intelligence, contacts, hacking into trying to get into Western democracies, and also to try to foment trouble, to try to back often the more divisive parties and political figures within any society. We've seen it in Italy, we've seen it in France, probably in the UK during Brexit. And for any party, in whether it be Democrats at the moment and the Conservatives in the UK, the problem is that a recession, heating bills soaring, fuel bills soaring, inevitably brings discontent, no matter who you are and what situation is. And there's a real chance that therefore, the less war-minded, the less defence-minded, some would say, and those who are insistent on cutting aid and looking after those at home first and foremost will get a lot of votes. And it is quite an understandable, natural political reaction. In fact, I'm quite heartened by the resolve that the governing Conservative Party in the UK has shown so far to continue to back Ukraine with various different tranches of aid militarily and not only.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point, because I'm not the biggest fan of the Conservatives in the UK, but actually, Boris Johnson was very strong, Liz Truss was very strong, and I was worried whether Sunak would come out the gates being very strong on Ukraine, and he actually realised, because actually in the UK it's a bit of a PR thing as well. So I think the Ukraine is a popular support of Ukraine is popular in the UK. So therefore, if any of those leaders were going to go against that, then it'd be bad for optics. So not only is it good, I think, strategically in a global kind of geopolitical landscape, but also it's good for their own optics. So I think it's a win-win helping Ukraine. It's just how sustainable that is going forward.
Yeah, and Rishi, through his wife, obviously, and his wife's father, of which she was a massive shareholder, benefited directly from trade with Russia that I think is still active as well through that company. So I think everyone's going to be looking and saying, well, if he's slightly less supportive of Ukraine and slightly less critical of Russia, then they'll immediately jump to that link. So I was quite expecting quite a strong response from him at that time, and also to keep the Conservative Party united and support his own position as leader, because we've seen how quickly they can change leaders. Then he had to be strong at this time. But yeah, going forward, when the bite really starts to happen, and when the aid in the form of a price cap for households in the UK is set to end, how things will happen then in the early stages of 2023 remains to be seen.
Yeah, and it's interesting whether Ukraine know about these kind of time issues with regard to support. They know. I did hear I think on Ukraine the latest podcast, where they're sort of talking about opinions from certain politicians in Ukraine, and they were referring to Zelensky as well. They know that aid won't go on forever, so they don't take it for granted, and they fully understand that these timescales are really important, so on and so forth. So then when you come to look at things like Kherson and how that happened, and that happened really quickly, and they've got that out the way, they must be thinking this is good, because actually before people's goodwill runs out, we need to be making meaningful advances. What are your thoughts, to talk about Kherson, what are your thoughts about how that played out, both from a Ukrainian point of view and a Russian point of view?
I think it was a fantastic achievement, first and foremost. Very few people expected it to happen so quickly, but what a magnificent military operation it was, because there was no street battle, there was no destruction of the city or any of the other satellite villages around. It was purely a strategic effort from a long way back. You may remember the first time that the Antonivsky Bridge was bombed, and then shortly afterwards a couple of other bridges around Nova Kakhovka and Kakhovka itself by the hydroelectric plant. And gradually the supply lines were cut. It was becoming extremely difficult for them to source through Crimea even, and particularly over the land bridge to go west of the river, and the right bank was gradually being cut off of Russian resources. It was impossible for them to continue, and therefore, of course, eventually they took the decision to flee, and so the city of Kherson is back in Ukrainian hands. I mean, how you reclaim the only major capital provincial city without actually having a battle over the city itself, it's a textbook success, and it is a humiliation for Russia. And hence the war bloggers were because they just got their man in, if you like, because they've managed to get a military scalp, and because they're pretty beholden to Prigozhin and the mercenary group Wagner, they had to support this decision because it was taken so early in the new reign, shall we say, of the new real leadership of the Russian military operation.
Yeah, Surovikin, I think it has had, people that could have gone against what he did, being supportive of what he did, but I think they were pretty realistic in their understanding of that. I mean, this Sun Tzu quote is quite useful to look at in this context. If I can get rid of that rubbish. So build your opponent a golden bridge to retreat across. So this is the idea that if your opponent wants to retreat, let them retreat, because there's all this talk about capturing them in there, wiping out as many people as possible, wiping out as many pieces of equipment as possible. Some people, and I actually think Russia did a very good job of retreating. So as far as operational withdrawals go, they did a bit of deception. They said there's an evacuation, a civilian evacuation going on, and they used that to hide most of their troops getting across and a whole load of equipment, to the point that some Western officials are now saying that really they only lost tens of pieces of equipment. Most of the stuff you're seeing in Kherson at the moment that the Ukrainians get hold of were inoperable, already blown up, already damaged. But actual kind of abandoned through rush, it would be a case of tens. But this is my idea of this flipped when someone posted a comment saying the Ukraine's number one consideration is not losing their own troops. And if that's your number one consideration, then actually Kherson is a complete success. They built their opposition a golden bridge. If you want to retreat, go for it. We'll take this, because actually our success isn't about killing Russian troops. It's about taking back our land. We've taken back our land and we've not lost our troops, and you are now humiliated.
Yeah, there's a lot to be said for that. Russia obviously has a much larger population, and it's ruled almost as a military dictatorship where democracy doesn't come into it. So as we've seen, they can do what they like. They can smash up violent rebellions. But in Ukraine, it isn't like that. And if there is mass conscription there, then mobilization of the ordinary civilians would not be greeted as warmly, shall we say, and would cause a problem. And that would start to cause a bigger problem with the economy that Ukraine is still trying to limp along with the aid of the West. So, yeah, it is absolutely essential. And there have been huge losses for Ukraine as well, not just for Russia, even though they're not publicized in the same way. And Russia doesn't do itself any good by posting just ridiculous figures. If you add it all up, they've probably killed every single male in Ukraine already, as they've downed more aircraft than Ukraine ever had in its history, I believe. So there have been enormous losses for Ukraine. But they do know that Russia will come again. Russia will fight. Russia will probably try to reinvade, looking at their bluster at least. The west bank of the Dnipro in Kherson Oblast. And I do think it's a military success to allow a retreat, but I do think it's a military mistake not to have taken out more of the weapons. I mean, they do have drones, they do have satellites, they do have intelligence. And one wonders whether Ukraine was part of a tacit agreement to let this retreat happen, or advised it wouldn't be in their best interest to use Ukrainian weapons against defenseless soldiers potentially waiting to cross the Dnipro with a bridge that's a bit rickety and full of holes and a barge that doesn't travel too quickly.
So many people have talked about this potential agreement between the sides, and it's obviously a fog of war. It's impossible to know at the moment, but yeah, it seems to have gained a lot of popularity as a kind of theory.
It seems strange that the defense minister is posting on the very evening that the last Russian troops are leaving that there are 40,000 when most had said somewhere between 25 and 30,000, and they're stranded and they can't cross. There's no escape. And bear in mind that Ukraine has boasted that they've had fire control of all exit routes across the river for a long time now. It's very surprising indeed that Russia didn't suffer the kind of casualties that we were led to believe that were happening. I mean, when we heard there were explosions at the Kakhovka Dam, when we heard that there were explosions on the Antonivsky Bridge, we all, I think, every single one that I read assumed that it was Ukraine destroying the fleeing troops with or without their weapons and artillery.
And it just, I mean, it's very evident that actually they didn't capture many POWs at all. I mean, you know, as there really is hardly any. There's a few dressed in civilian clothes that were kind of mopped up, but realistically, I think Russia did really successfully retreat from here. But I think, as Churchill said about Dunkirk, you know, glorious retreats aren't what win wars, or something like that. So yes, they did a really good job of getting themselves out of Kherson, but now I think we're going to start seeing the trained Ukrainian troops who have been trained in the UK starting to filter back in. We'll see some of those Kherson troops being able to be redeployed, as well as obviously the Russians. But it'll be interesting to see what happens next. I've got a couple of options that I talked about in a previous video about what happens next, and it could be a combination of all of these. And I don't know about your military tactician skills here, Tim, but the one option could be they Svatove up north and then sort of take Starobilsk, which is a very important rail hub that feeds this whole area down here. If you take out Starobilsk, then the Russians would have to bring in all of their supplies by the back door rather than down from the top. Or the second one could be come down to the coast by Mariupol, or come down to Melitopol, not do a battle against a city, but kind of hook to the west and come along the coast and sort of cut off again. If you cut supplies down here, then the whole of Crimea, because of the Kerch Bridge, is done for. And the third option is do something from Kherson, maybe from the Kimburn Spit, whilst also across the river, or what have you. If you were a general, what would you do, Tim?
First of all, I'd strike number 3 off. I just don't think that's viable. It's basically any troops that you land on there are almost prisoners, almost trapped. It's very difficult to make progress. There's nothing tangible to achieve in the Kimburn Spit, really. I just don't see the advantage of going there. You are sitting ducks. It's very difficult to get real numbers in support, even though there have been donations of a lot more craft from the USA in one of the most recent tranches promised. So it's between number 1 and number 2, and both certainly have a lot of viability. I'm really in preference of the line you've drawn there from Zaporizhia south, and I think going into Melitopol will be the next important, significant move, and from there trying to control all the towns on the south going into Kherson Oblast, Skadovsk and Chaplinka, where we've seen heavy explosions recently, and then stopping that land bridge, as you talked about, as long as they can fortify the areas and know that they're not going to get pincer movement themselves from Crimea and from Mariupol, which would still be in Russian hands at that point. But I think that's the most vulnerable place for the Russians, Melitopol, and from there also mopping up hopefully Henichesk, the second Russian capital within Kherson in a matter of weeks. And I think that's the most achievable, the most doable at the moment. And I think if they can hold territory in Donetsk and in the few villages that they've managed to reclaim in Luhansk and liberate there, then that would be a sensible achievement for Ukraine heading into the winter. I still think they can get Melitopol before the big freeze, or some point during December leading up to the new year, which they celebrate.
Yeah, a lot of people are talking about the winter war and that being a problem, but an awful lot of other people are saying actually it shouldn't be a problem. The ground freezes over. It's
Yeah.
actually more easy to move. It's easier to move heavy equipment around on, and they why would they need to stop? You know that they should be capable enough of fighting within those in those conditions, and they've actually been given a lot more winter equipment than the Russians appear to have. So they might have a competitive advantage, if you like, over the Russians. So we could see quite an active winter.
Yeah, absolutely. The freezing of the land is important for the movement in terrain, for sure. It is difficult to fight a war in winter in such conditions for any troops. And looking at some of the videos that have come out of the underground situation, living quarters, shall we say, for Ukrainian troops and Russian troops, there is a huge difference. So I know that Ukraine has been well preparing. We sent over some solar panels, some mini gas stoves and things like that in our recent fundraiser. And I think
that's you personally, isn't it, Tim?
Yeah, in our fundraiser that I had on Twitter, we raised not far off 6,000 UK. I think in the end, after fees and taxes and stuff like that, it came to about $6,500 US, and we managed to buy a lot of equipment, winter equipment specifically, because this was never going to end, sadly, before Christmas. But yeah, ground can be taken in the likes of Luhansk and Donetsk, especially where it gets very boggy, a lot of rain. Movement will be easier come middle to end of December, where, depending on global warming, of course, when we expect the lands to start freezing over and we get a pretty permafrost for about 3 months of the year. But it's difficult to get troops to work as hard. The little daylight, fatigue, extreme cold, disease, everything like that. So it's a human angle as well as simply the terrain.
That's a really good point. There's a couple of videos I did the other week where I talked about exactly that. People don't often take into account how little light there is in the winter months compared to in the summer months. Literally, you've got half the time to do your fighting. And also just how demotivating the cold is. You know, I was talking about how it was quite cold here and a bit damp. And I was like, oh, I can't be bothered to go down the end of the garden and empty the compost bin. Or, you know, I was like, oh, I'm going to stay inside. I was just thinking, geez, like, you know, minus 15 with your face in the mud. Like, this is a very real challenge for anyone fighting out there, is like actually wanting to move and do things and you know, be bothered, or all that. I know it's be bothered, I'm underplaying it here, but the challenges are very psychological and also, you know, meteorological.
Yeah, I remember in 2014, I heard some awful stories when the war first broke out, and when it was almost, I guess, 30, 40, maybe 50% volunteers fighting, and the Ukrainian army was just in disarray. And Poroshenko, for faults that he may have had and opponents he may have had, did a really good job of shaping up the Ukrainian army pretty quickly. But I know people personally, I know relatives of friends who just didn't even have proper boots to try and fight the war at that stage. Now they are better resourced. I don't think the Russians are as well sourced, particularly the mob chicks, or whatever you want to call them, newly mobilized. They're asking relatives to buy their own equipment and being promised some money, but then not getting it, which is a bone of discontent. And it comes back to also, as you said, the motivation. They know what they're fighting for, the Ukrainians. They are fighting for their lives. They are fighting for their families' lives. They are fighting for the flag, for the homeland. They're fighting for freedom, for democracy in a country that has been repressed and occupied for the majority of its existence. And remember that Ukraine is actually older and referred to in documents well before Russia, and even before Moscow really became any sort of power base. So the motivation is there for the Russians. Missing home, not there for New Year, not there for the Orthodox Christmas. There must be questions. What are we doing here? Why are we doing this? When you're being pounded by shells and there's 6-7 hours of daylight a day, and you're cold and you're miserable with poor equipment, the motivation will really fade away, I think. So there could be an advantage in winter for the motivated, for those who know what they're doing and well resourced. And hopefully, I do hope that benefits Ukraine.
So So going back to, you can look at this map, or let's go to the War Mapper one. I'm really interested in this idea of, if let's just do some counterfactuals. So if, or hypotheticals, if Ukraine kind of won, or at least took back all of these red areas, right? And they are then faced with Crimea and the annexed regions of the Donetsk and Luhansk from 2014. What, how easy would it be to liberate those areas? And I'm really interested in what the psychology of the people living there. Now, I heard an analysis the other day that said Crimea would be easier to liberate than Luhansk and Donetsk, because a lot of the Crimeans would have been shipped down there and weren't really naturally from there after that period, and maybe a lot of left or will leave if the Ukrainians went in. Donetsk and Luhansk is maybe a little bit more complex, and whether their opinions have changed over the war. And so on and so forth. So, do you have any thoughts about how popular Ukraine and the Ukrainian government will be as a liberating force?
Well, not directly. I don't know people who've been living there through the war now. I have a couple of acquaintances, but not people I could discuss the war with happily. Everyone from those regions and Crimea, whom I knew or was acquaintance with, friends with, they all moved away from any hint of Russian control. They went to Kiev, the majority of them. And so it's very difficult to gauge exactly what the situation would be. Crimea, yeah, there has been a lot of people pushed in by Russia, obviously. But how easy is it to, it will still be their home, not their homeland, but it's still their home, and the upset of having to leave, deservedly so. They shouldn't have moved there in the first place, but it's still, and I'm not sure it would be easy. And Crimea is definitely attached to the Russian psyche in a way that Donetsk and Luhansk absolutely would not be. So if you come to negotiations on how to end the war, then potentially Russia would be, well, they would be more willing to give up Donetsk and Luhansk as long as they kept Crimea, but that would be almost the last resort. For Ukraine and its government and Zelensky, and in fact, my brother this morning was discussing with me, what sort of compromise would Ukraine make? And I think there would be no political future, and there would be huge protests, potentially violent among the population, if Ukraine came anywhere near ceding territory in the mainland, not including the peninsula. Crimea, it's a very difficult one, and that could be, as many people have said for a long time, the way to end this war, potentially back to a completely independent state with no political allegiance. But how that works, one simply doesn't know. Independence for Crimea as a separate entity, not reliant on Russia and without any military weapons, could be another one. Would that mean that the Russian naval fleet would have to move out of Sevastopol? Yes, it would.
And that would be the whole point of Russia wanting to keep Crimea, really. Exactly. I mean, it's just the strategic utility of the place.
I mean, it's far be it from you and I, Jonathan, to discuss what Ukraine should do and what the Ukrainian people should do. But I do know that it's impossible for Zelensky to concede any ground in Donetsk and Luhansk and survive, and the country just would not stand for that. So.
Do you mean, does that include the 2014 annexed area? So
yeah,
literally,
there's no
because
way.
they keep talking about, Zelensky keeps saying, we will get everything back. That's just non-negotiable. But of course, then that would be completely unacceptable to Putin. So it would require a complete victory militarily for Ukraine to be able to establish that kind of.
Yeah, and let's look at it from the other side as well. I've talked briefly about Zelensky in Ukraine, but also for the Russian people. Even if Putin goes and someone else comes in who's more liberal, isn't as hardline, isn't as anti-Western, they are still not going to be able to sell the loss of Crimea. So they would be kicked out of office almost immediately, even if they got there, which is highly unlikely. It will be another hardliner, and no hardliner will accept the loss of Crimea. They will fight until the last person standing, same as Ukraine will fight to the last person standing to reclaim their territory and fight off a Russian invasion. So it will come down to Crimea, I think, at the end. Donetsk and Luhansk, I mean, in 2012, I was there. I was seeing during the European Championships, European Football Championships, the absolute pride and passion for Ukraine. England's football team played there. It was incredible. You never ever thought that there was any pro-Russian sentiment. There was clearly a lot of families. There's a lot of travel between the two. A lot of people with still Russian relatives and a lot of Ukrainians who no longer speak to those relatives because they just don't believe what's been happening throughout the country. So it's difficult for whoever wins this war and whoever controls those two states, Donetsk and Luhansk, by the end of the war, at the conclusion of the war. It will be difficult for either side to control, to ensure that everybody is even remotely happy, and for the other side to accept the situation. And I still firmly believe that it's with Ukraine. I don't think they will cede the territory, but whether all the people will move back gladly to Donetsk and Luhansk, having moved away, emigrated, or majority of them coming to Kiev and other big cities, and Lviv also, and Kharkiv, remains to be seen. But one would hope that the people would return home joyously, and that would balance the feeling in favor of Ukraine. And hopefully, if there's a lot of Western investment, and Donetsk can recover the sort of dominance in trade that it had, and the manufacturing industries and the coal mining can at least be upgraded and somehow made a little bit easier for the people in terms of the heavy manufacturing base in the Donbass, then you can placate and gradually turn minds back towards Ukraine, even of the most stout pro-Russian sympathizers in those two states.
I guess money makes the wheels go round, and I don't know whether this is oversimplifying, but the idea that in 2014 you probably had quite a depressed state of affairs, economically speaking, in the Donetsk, Luhansk region. These very much maybe partly forgotten industrial heartlands of the country. I mean, I know from the UK's point of view, this is an issue probably the world over. As economies mature and go on, then the manufacturing heartlands become less competitive and get left behind. But these are important. They produced important stuff. There's ores, very important things produced in Ukraine. But I guess it is people are generally all right if they're well off, aren't they? Do you know what I mean? It's like if the people in Luhansk and Donetsk had jobs and had a good welfare state system that's working, and everything was working for them, and they had decent lives, then they'd be broadly happy with the Ukrainian government, I guess. So it's like trying to achieve all these things.
Maslow's pyramid triangle of needs, isn't it?
Yeah.
As long as you're safe, first and foremost, as long as your family is safe, as long as you've got enough food, and then you've got a good job, and your life balance changes. And after that, although many refuse to believe it, after that it's who the flag is and who controls. Because generally, a good state shouldn't really matter who is controlling, but when it's a repressive state like Russia invading another, then it absolutely matters, and that becomes the top of your pyramid, as Maslow would have put it. Because without that, you don't get happiness. Without that, your family's not safe. You're not safe. The food situation is getting worse. The prices are increasing. Even if you can get hold of food, it's difficult to afford. So Maslow was right in that aspect. Supply people with good jobs, good homes, security, and then I think pretty soon any population in Donetsk and Luhansk and even Crimea would soon rally around the Ukrainian flag, albeit at first a little reluctantly.
But I mean, it does make you understand that if and when this war, comes to its end, and if Ukraine are to prevail, the work starts then. Almost, it's such a huge job of rebuilding, and the amount of money and effort and support from the rest of the world that would be required is quite phenomenal. But
Yeah, absolutely. I guess China and the US will be queuing up with people able to help, but it will cost a lot of money at a time when there's not a lot of money to spare in the world. To touch on something you said earlier, Jonathan.
yeah, and I guess this is where like everyone starts thinking, oh, what interesting natural resources you have, Ukraine, and then you then start worrying about Ukraine being taken advantage of by lots of different players. But anyway, that's a whole other conversation. So with Putin, because again, I'm always asking myself, A, if I was Putin, what would I do? Like if I was Putin, not me as Putin, but Putin, like, and I had these narcissistic and imperialistic tendencies, what would be the best option for me to take now? Where would I attack? What would I do? And also, can Putin win? Like, what is there any path for Putin to reclaim any of the lands that he's lost? For example, like Kherson. What are your thoughts with regards
Yes,
to that?
there is, but only at huge cost, I think, because I think most military strategists will tell you that attacking incurs the biggest losses, especially if your enemy has dug in well. Ukraine has lessened its losses to some extent during its counterattack with exceptional weapons, the best on the battlefield by far, mainly provided by the Americans in this instance, although they were a little slow joining the party. Some might say a replica of World War II, but let's gloss over that. But yeah, from Putin's point of view, I can't see him surviving. I really cannot. Whenever this ends, I can't see him surviving. I think his best outcome is that he's allowed to hand over the reins semi-gracefully and live the rest of his life like a Gorbachev figure. Militarily, I think it would be suicide to try to reattack the areas that have been lost so far, with the exception of the few villages in Luhansk and Donetsk, where there hasn't been a major change on the front line for a long time. I still think they can make ground there. And had they stuck to their original plan of trying to liberate those two territories, this war, sadly, may have been de facto over, and the West may well have lost interest and financial interest as well, because it was quite conceivable that had Russia concentrated its efforts purely on the entire Donetsk and Luhansk region, that they would have got there, and Ukraine would have been forced to admit that these two states were not under control for the foreseeable future.
I think you're absolutely right. I think there's so many mistakes I can see being made. I mean, too many to talk about, but just spreading themselves so thin that they can't adequately, like a man to double business bound, like Bruden's ass. If caught between two places, you end up getting nowhere. And here we've got a massively long front that is too sparsely occupied with Russian troops, that they can't effectively do any offensive. Whereas, pull it back here, pull it back there. Let's concentrate on Luhansk and Donetsk to begin with. Like all of their army concentrates on that. Okay, job done there. Right, then where else? So you think of all these situations, but then you just think, A, Putin is not a military strategist. He was FSB, KGB, and B, if you're getting rubbish information, you are going to make bad decisions. And there's a guy called Perron on YouTube who did a fantastic video the other day about Vranyo, which is this idea of basically bullshitting. So, and how it gets worse as it goes further up the line of the hierarchy of command. So that if, you inflate you lie to your boss, but then your boss knows that you're lying to him, and you know that he knows you're lying to him, but he signs it off anyway, and then he lies to his boss, but inflates it even more. So by the time this kind of information or whatever gets to the top of the chain, it's just completely wrong. And then the guys at the top of the chain saying, "Oh, this is amazing! Right, let's go and do this because we've got all this information." And it's just a web of lies. So my point has always been that Putin has made terrible decisions because he's got terrible information.
Yeah, well, we touched on that in the first discussion, didn't we, a few weeks ago, Jonathan, that the fact they expected to walk into Kherson and other cities, particularly Mariupol and Kharkiv, and they met any resistance, seemed to come as a shock to them. Even some of the early prisoners of war were saying that we were told we wouldn't even need guns. People would be throwing flowers at us, not grenades. So there was a huge breakdown in intelligence. And I think you can also say the same for both countries about corruption as well, about it seeping through from the bottom up, that people kind of learn to live with corruption, accept it goes on, but actually they're also a little bit corrupt themselves in that, well, I'm not really corrupt, but when I need to go into hospital, or if my parents need to go into hospital, I'll pay to make sure that they get proper treatment. I'll pay to make sure they get a nurse, because otherwise they wouldn't do, and the state doesn't really help. So so many people are involved in minor corruption on that level, and nepotism, and might have at some point got their relative a job or helped them get a job in a way that wouldn't be done in a non-corrupt society, shall we say. So there are still problems in Ukraine, and it's far, far worse in Russia. And Ukraine is doing its best, I believe, to get rid of the corruption, and the West is putting pressure on. There are still certain questions to be asked, even of Zelensky, who's almost beyond reproach at the moment, but I'm keeping a careful eye on that. But yeah, to go back to the intelligence angle, it was horrendous for Putin, and what he's being told now and by whom, we don't know. But they, as far as I see it, Prigozhin and Wagner are pretty much controlling the military, effort now. They are virtually, if not 50-50 with the Ministry of Defense, possibly even more. And I think Prigozhin has made himself so public. I really see him as launching a presidential bid, possibly already underway, with some of those who are able to wield any sort of power within the Kremlin or near to the Kremlin circles at the moment. I think it's the early stages of a presidential run, either with or without Putin's backing at some point.
I mean, some people might think, brilliant, let's get rid of Putin. But if you're going to replace him with someone like Prigozhin, then things aren't going to go in the right direction. You've got a military guy in charge of a dictatorship, of being a dictator, effectively, who is a ruthless military guy, and that's not going to help things at all. So you want a complete regime change, you want a complete revolution. But it's this idea of lying and corruption that so many people talk about this with regard to Russia, and how it's so inherent in the society, that how do you cure that, how do you manage to eradicate that? And certainly nothing can happen quickly. But I guess Ukraine have been trying to do that for some years now with the help of outside actors. So I guess it's like opening yourself up to a globalized community and saying, right, help us out here.
Yeah, it kind of is, and they do have an anti-corruption bureau, but again, there've been problems about that. There were changes of leadership, depending on which side you believed. It was because of influence from the oligarchs, or it was because the president didn't want too much investigation into what was going on. From Zelensky's angle, I made a documentary about potential links with Dnipro and almost mafia-like state that it existed in Dnipro, which is quite often spoken of in glowing terms. But there are various questions of corruption, and for anyone who questions the authority there, usually gets well, should I choose my words carefully, can get a visit from a virtual private army, a municipal guard that's paid for directly by the oligarchs controlling the city. So there are huge problems in Ukraine. We admit that, but you don't change overnight. Georgia managed to do it fairly successfully at the dissolution of the Soviet Union, probably the best of all the ex-Soviet states, with the exception of the Baltic states, which were well down that path anyway, of completely divesting themselves of Russian influence and interests. So you look to Georgia's example, but also you look to how Georgia has turned around in some respects and is back under a lot of influence from Russia. And I think that ongoing, that is the problem for Ukraine as well. There will still be a lot of Russian money, a lot of Russian influence way after this war ends. And I think that's also one of the reasons why NATO and many of their members are hesitant, although they want to help Ukraine, to accept Ukraine into NATO. A lot of people, some people were writing to me this week saying, why on earth did we accept NATO? Why did NATO accept Turkey in? Because at the time we didn't know what Turkey would turn into. We didn't know we would get a very right-wing, almost fundamentalist leader. We didn't know we'd get someone who was going to be trading with Russia openly and helping them. At that point, you can't predict 100% the future, who will be in control. and what influence will come from other sources, and which way the people's minds will go. So, will accepting Ukraine into NATO be a good step? I'm not so sure, but at this moment we have to give 100% backing to them as NATO and as individual members.
Excellent. Well, as we sort of come towards the end, if anyone has any really quick questions, get them in right now. But the last thing I was going to say, I guess, was this idea, and I haven't read the paper, but so I heard reference to a Financial Times article talking about how even now it's the idea that Putin actually can't lose here. So even if Putin loses this war, the fact that he's made it about challenging NATO, about challenging the Western world order, there is some sense that even if they retreat out with nothing, or maybe with those 2014 annexed regions, that he's still won because he's been ballsy enough to go and do that, and as a PR kind of thing, that might sit quite well with a lot of the Russian public. I don't know.
Well, it's the old, forgive me for all your overseas viewers, but it's the old Millwall thing, as we used to say, a club that was a football club that was not very well liked by a lot of the country. And it was they all hate us, we don't care. And saying that everyone hates you, same as Trump employed really these tactics in the US quite successfully, that they all hate us, they're all against us, they're all corrupt. We're the only ones that are going to protect you. And that has been Putin. Without me protecting you as Putin, then you won't survive, Russia won't survive, NATO wants to do this, this and this, etc. And it is quite an old tactic, but it's quite a successful one for getting the public behind you, no matter what the circumstances. I say no matter what the circumstances, but if he comes out of this with a heavy defeat, with humiliation, with the country with almost no working military, that couldn't have another offensive for many, many years, with industry in tatters, with people losing jobs, with sanctions still crippling people, and with sky-high inflation, and with people turning away from fossil fuels, so the future not looking too bright either, then there won't be a future for Putin, no matter how much people write about him coming out of this in a no-lose situation. For me, it's a no-win situation in the long term.
Yeah, I think I tend to agree with you there. And the body bags, when the reality of the body bags hits, there'll be an awful lot of Russian families that just haven't heard from so many of their children, brothers, loved ones, friends, and they're thinking, oh, they're just down on the front lines, but they're dead in a ditch somewhere, or in some kind of Ukrainian morgue or whatever. I'm sure once the reality of the war hits to the Russian public, it really hits home. This, might be far more controversial than one might think. I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. I just seen a point someone saying Ukraine can't join NATO while they have occupied land.
True.
Is it a good excuse? And it is part of the doctrine. But assuming, as Solman says there, but assuming that the land isn't occupied, that some agreement is reached by the end of the war, that's what we were talking about, that in future potentially Ukraine might fulfill all the criteria to get in. Whether they'll be accepted or not remains a moot point. But yeah, the body bags thing, it is interesting, because I've seen the first very small penetration into the media, the protests, some of the mothers, wives, girlfriends directly confronting the general. That got a little bit of traction in Russian media at a very low level, when they went and talked about a whole battalion of newly mobilized conscripts being just wiped out, 500 losses in Donbass a couple of weeks or so ago. And they actually marched up to one of the generals at the recruiting, at the training grounds for the recruits as well, and pleading not for the war to end or asking questions why they die, but just for those who survived to be given help to return.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I remember that well. I was just here it is. I think. Oh no, I can't find it. But yes, that the 500 people, dying pretty much all in one fell swoop was pretty devastating for those family members. Well,
Within 3 weeks of being called up as well. Within 3 weeks of getting their call-up papers and doing 1 week's training, if that, 2 or 3 days to get to their point of training, a week's training, sent to the front line, and within a week, most of their friends are in body bags.
It's quite incredible. My update video hasn't gone out yet because I had some issues. I had some real brain farts this morning from my multiple sclerosis brain that was just like really struggling with everything. And but again, these stories about mobilized troops and the conditions they're in, and then this interview I was watching with a tank crew up in Kharkiv saying we're just bombing the heck out of these people, and they're just filling up the gaps with mobilized soldiers. It's just like a meat. They're saying it's a meat grinder. They're putting. They're just this. We're throwing 50 shells a day out of our tank, and that keeps happening. And you just think, wow, they really are using these mobilized troops as cannon fodder.
They are, and they do say the truth will come out, and I really do hope it will in future. And also, the one thing to think of is whoever is the next leader can get some political capital in Russia by bringing the true horrors of war home. So even it's like Prigozhin, he can say, well, I was nothing to do with the conscripts. We had a very well-trained military, albeit mercenaries, and they didn't suffer nearly half as much, and they didn't retreat, and we were successful in Donbass while Kherson was being lost, while Kharkiv was being lost, etc., etc. And then say, did you know that we lost 100,000 and another 200,000 maimed, something like this? The figures that will shock and cause some hatred towards Putin, and allow the mothers to express the grief and the relatives. And then we could see some sort of change in Russian society, but it would still leave Prigozhin or successor, who could well be very militaristic and very hard line, nationalistic, in an increased sense of power, and not quite as vulnerable. But I think that's something that a future leader of Russia will do.
So difficult turning that super tanker around the Russian super tanker. And I guess the last thing I'd say would be this. It's completely gone, actually. Can I just say thank you so much to 10K there for your contribution? Really, really do appreciate that. Thank you. I was going to say something about Russia. I've forgotten it. Oh well. Is there any last thing you want to say, Tim, about anything that's getting your goat at the moment, or you find particularly interesting, or anything to look out for going forward in the next sort of week or so?
I think the battle for Melitopol, as I said, is not going to be too far away. I think what is going to be very interesting is the reports we've had of all the equipment and now personnel being moved out of Novokakhovka and further south, even moving back towards Crimea, stuff they thought was safe military hardware in Chaplinka in the airport there, which I hope will become the new Chernobyivka. As
I always look for the rotating meme that you put on of Chernobyivka. Brilliant.
I didn't make it, but it's well used every time there was a strike. For those of you who don't follow me on Twitter, why don't you? And secondly, there was a meme of literally Russia restocking their airfield, Ukraine waiting and bombing the hell out of it. Numerous losses seen on satellite images, and the meme just shows a revolving door, a revolving stage, if you like, and all the old bombed equipment being shoved into the great abyss, as happened frequently. So I think Chaplinka is a place to watch out for. Skadovsk, near the south coast, on the south coast of the Ukraine mainland as well, heading towards Crimea and southern Kherson region, will be the key areas over the next 2 to 3 weeks, and throw in Melitopol in probably the next 5 to 6 weeks, as well, we head towards the end of 2022. Hopefully a little quicker. We'll wait and see.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, VA there. Really appreciate such a great member of the channel. Really, really thank you so much for that, and to 10K for your contributions. And thank you to Tim. So thank you, Jonathan, Tim. Always insightful to hear what you gentlemen have to say. Great conversation. Thank you both. Really appreciate that. And to all you guys, thank you. Please follow Tim on Twitter, and you can find him at is at TWMC Limited. Is that correct?
Yep, it's on the screen, I think, isn't it, as well? So, you should be able to find me, or just search Tim White Ukraine on Twitter. I'm sure you'll find it. Thanks again. Thanks, Jonathan. Thanks to everyone for your comments. Sorry we couldn't get through them all, but if anyone has any comments to make here, I'll try and chip in after this live broadcast has ended. And also on Twitter, you can contact me. My DMs are open.
Absolutely, and I'll tell you what, Tim is part of my daily routine on Twitter, so make sure you definitely follow him, please, on Twitter. Well worth it. Anyway, thank you all. Thank you for the lively chat. Thank you for hanging out with us. And I look forward, hopefully, to speaking to Tim again, maybe in a couple of weeks' time, if he's up for that. But in the meantime, take care, Tim. Thank you so much, and well done with your fundraising for the equipment to Ukraine. That's really, really valuable and much more meaningful than me talking bollocks on YouTube. So well done. And thank you to all those who have tuned in. Check out my videos later today. But in the meantime, toodle pips, everyone. And thanks again, Tim.